All right, good morning. Hi, everybody. Starting. It's the early session of the last day, and I really want to thank you for being here. I almost skipped it, so thank you so much for coming out. This is the power of working code and designers who develop, and we'll see if you can guess who's the designer and who's the developer. Or more accurately, the power of, quote, working code. Some introductions. I'm Aaron Shekey. I'm a product designer. I look wildly different from how I did a year ago when we took that. This is about a year worth of growing out my hair. So yeah, I'm a product designer and I work at a company called GitHub. I'm sure you're familiar with that one. And Adobe I worked at previously. But before then I worked at a company called Seventh Sin, which was an agency in Minneapolis. So I started making websites, and then at Adobe I made tools for people who make websites, and now at GitHub I make tools for people who make tools. But more importantly, I'm a musician. I play in a band called The Usual Things. Those are 2 records up top there. The one on the right was produced by Art Alexakis of Everclear. That was our claim to fame. That was pretty great. But I play in a band called American Scarecrows. So working musician, that's me, product designer.
And if you hadn't guessed, hi, I'm Ellen. I'm the director of iOS engineering at Vocal in Chicago. I used to work at a place called The Nerdery, and my boss at The Nerdery, Ryan McGrew, actually used to be the bass player in The Usual Things, and he has actually been friends with this guy since elementary school. And when Aaron reached out to Ryan to look for iOS developers to help him out with this idea that he had, Ryan sent him directly to me because Ryan knew not only was I an iOS developer, I'm also a recovering singer-songwriter. I even put out an album once. It's actually available on Spotify and RDO. I will warn you that I put this out when I was 17, so the lyrics are very teenagery. Because I had a lot of experience writing songs, when Ryan asked me if I'd be interested in helping his friend build this application to help improve the process of songwriting, I immediately wanted to know more. And that's when Aaron gave me the pitch for Hum, which he is going to give you right now.
Let's do a demo, shall we? Pray to the QuickTime gods that this works. I had to restart the computer right before this. There we are, it's reacting. Okay, so this is Hum. Hum combines audio recording and lyric writing hold on, I'll try not to rotate that, into a single sortable place for all your songwriting ideas. So this is my working songwriting library. I've got 200 some ideas of things that could that just spring to me. It's about capturing the things while you have them, while you're inspired, while you're driving in the car, for example, at a red light. Nobody ever would do that. Or you're on the bus or wherever. So these are all my songwriting ideas. So to add a song, I just press the tap button, tap the add button at the top there. And then I've got a field for title and lyrics. I've got an audio recorder down at the bottom, and I've also got a tuner if I was so inclined. We can also collect some metadata about the song. So we've got key, tuning, and mood. This slider down here is something we're going to talk about during this conversation. And then there's some fields for notes, so if you want to add some context to this. So if I wanted to add some lyrics, some more lyrics, there's that. And if I wanted to record something, I get a 3-second countdown. Check, check, 1, 2, hey. Ideally that'd be a guitar, I'd play you something, but I just don't like traveling with my guitar. I've seen enough horror stories. So anyway, there's that. If I wanted to, I could say that's in the key of E flat, for example. It was major. It was recorded at half a step down, and it was very happy, but also kind of quiet. Then I could add some notes, presenting. Da-da-da. And that's the song. So if I go back to the library, This is the latest one that we just added, the add some lyrics at the top there. But what becomes really powerful is if I'm stuck in a rut or I have a verse and I need to finish a song, I can sort my existing library by key tuning and move those same metadata. So if I wanted to, I could check, just give me all the ideas in E flat, for example, and then I could play one of these. You can barely hear that, but. So that could be my verse, for example, or the chorus to whatever I'm working on at the moment. That's the main gist of it. I can also share via text and email and all that. And I could also print if I want to bring that to rehearsal or what have you. What's that? Oh, yeah. So under the settings screen, you could see that we have syncing to Dropbox, and Ellen spent a lot of time on that, and so
I'll be talking about that later.
You can't not mention that. But that's the demo. That's what we're talking about. So as a designer, why learn to code? I think there are a ton of reasons it's important to learn to code. Are there any designers in here at all? No? Yes? That guy, this is for you. He already knows how to code. So there are a ton of reasons to learn how to code, but I'm going to talk about 3 important reasons today. The most important, I think, is the ability to quit drawing pictures of apps. I think the top app that I use for designing apps is Photoshop. And I just think that's fucked up, for lack of a better phrase. The second biggest is to understand your craft. I think it's important to be as close to the metal as possible. And then the third, which is what we're talking about today, is to improve collaboration. Drawing pictures of apps is really great if you want to share the overall idea of the app, but I think so much delight comes from the in-betweens, and we'll talk about some of those. So this was the first sketch of Hum, and then I built it up into wireframing, and you can see it. If you squint, it's basically what we've got today. And then I designed at a high fidelity for iOS 6, so we've got those big shadows, which I ache for those. I miss them so much. But we wanted to be relevant to iOS 7. But even at this high fidelity, the shipping app can be so wildly different. And then the second point is to understand your craft. This is a great quote that was illuminated to me by Everything is a Remix. I don't know if you guys have seen that series. It is so great. But Hunter Thompson actually retyped The Great Gatsby just to know what it would feel like to write a great novel. And similarly, you don't have to play an instrument to write great songs, but it helps to have that lens to see through. It provides you the language to share your ideas, and if you have an intimate relationship with the instrument, you'll eventually be able to express what you actually like. So instead of relying on the skills of others. And then the third is to improve collaboration. Learning to code avoids this screen because, again, these are just photos. These are just pictures of what an app could be. And I'm sure we're all familiar with, it's just on Dropbox, check out the latest comps. And so we're really good at versioning these, but we still run into traps. So wherever you can, wherever I can, I like to meet my developers more than halfway. And so this could have been 16 emails. It could have been a marked up PDF, for example. But really, I just needed to, this is before AutoLayout, I needed to change the frame of the logo, and I needed to provide it at 2x. So instead of there being a back and forth between Ellen and I just, it's just a fresh commit. So how to learn to code, I'm not really going to talk about that actually, but I'm more about the mindset. If you really want to learn to code as a designer or even as somebody who's just starting out, my biggest takeaways were to be passionate, to find an idea, find something worth struggling through, and then start small, build tiny prototypes. You don't have to build the entire app. You can just build a single transition, for example. The third is embrace trial and error. My learning process was Googling for 8 hours. to not have results. There were some days where I would Google all day because this shit is hard. And the NDAs, for fuck's sake. I mean, honestly, share your knowledge if you can, please. And then along those lines, just be fearless in your incompetence. You're going to struggle. It's incredibly hard. And even seasoned developers have their work ruthlessly refactored. Yeah, but that didn't keep me from just starting to build something. And I think the best way to learn how to code is to just dive in and do it. So I took those comps and started building static builds of Hum. So just demo data that I tossed into a table view. But then eventually I got to a place where I was able to polish those broad strokes. And so when you're working on those details, those are things that I don't want real engineers to have to deal with. I don't want Ellen to have to fuck with colors or typeface choices. I can just do it. And similarly, I could just build transitions that look like this. So it's not quite a popover. It's kind of reveals this under thing, but I was able to mess around with all the animation curves and not have to annoy a developer who is worried about actually putting real data in there, doing some real CSI shit, and actually having it sync to Dropbox, etc. There's another one here. The settings reveal is a little interesting. It takes the plus button and it rotates when you tap the little gear. So little things like this, when you have such a small app, they go such a long way to make people feel like it's a quality app. So I was able to get this far just by hammering on Xcode and seeing what came out. So the idea is you can do this until you can't. You can get pretty far when you're just pushing around little boxes. But that's when you bring in a developer. So Ellen's going to speak to that.
So there's good news and there's bad news about coming into a project where you're working with someone like Aaron who's a designer. But he taught himself enough code to be dangerous. You guys saw some of the stuff that he was working on in a prototype fashion. And I want to talk first about the good news because there really is a lot about this. The first thing is that UI iteration, as Aaron was saying, gets so much easier because you cut out that entire process of going back and forth. Aaron was giving the feedback to himself rather than having to go through even a Slack channel or GitHub issues or anything like that as we go through these UI iterations. It actually forces you to write much clearer code as a developer. You can't get too cute with your code because the person you're working with really needs to be able to understand what it's doing so they can work with it. And there's a great saying from Brian Kerningham, who co-authored the first book on C with Dennis Ritchie. And his saying is that in order to debug code, you must be twice as smart as the person who wrote it. So if you write the most clever code you possibly can, by definition, you will never be able to debug it. And having someone who actually needs to read your code and see your intentions clearly really helps prevent this. It really helps you keep things as clear as possible. And finally, the biggest benefit is that having a designer who codes really helps you focus on the hardest parts of your code instead of just endlessly tweaking UI, as designers are wont to do. And when I talk about focusing on the hard parts, sometimes those are complicated bits of UI, like using AutoLayout in a paging scroll wheel or dealing with a search bar that isn't quite acting right. And you can pull these into these lovely separate projects, such as fucking search bar and fucking AutoLayout scroll views. And you can work outside the rest of your code, and you can get this working, and you can get it to a point where it's a lot happier. Another thing that you can work on is fixing bugs. You can keep your users happy. You can fix crashes. We have Crashlytics integration, so anytime we get a crash, we get a lovely automatic bug posted into GitHub. And so we now have many, many of them, but I am able to actually focus on fixing those things rather than sort of poking something one pixel up. Another thing is that you're able to work on complex features. So these are from when I decided that it would be a really brilliant idea to sync a relational database to Dropbox by watching saves on Core Data and then updating files in the Dropbox folder, having it sort of barf out a bunch of JSON, and having that sync. And I was like, oh yeah, that seems like a really good idea. That shouldn't be too hard. When I say this was complex, I mean it was 11 months of weekends from when I first took a stab at doing this to when we actually finally submitted the real build to Apple. Having Aaron able to focus on getting the overwhelming majority of the UI for all of this up and running, and then just needing to wire things up to real data, over that time allowed me to focus on the really, really difficult task that I had set for myself. It was also a task that we had absolutely no room to fuck up. We were in a position where people are trusting us with the hard work that they're doing of their songwriting. You can't be like, oh, oops, I accidentally deleted your entire library. That is not acceptable. And so that's something that I needed to be able to really focus on. And with Aaron taking care of a lot of the UI stuff, I was able to.
I was shipping features in the meantime.
Yeah,
too.
he was.
The tuner, and we did some other
Yeah,
things too,
the tuner. We got some help from a friend of Aaron's Evan Olcott. Yes, thank you. Sorry, bad with names. And it's something where you're able to continue to move forward, even if the thing that you're trying to do under the hood is really, really hard. So that's good news. There's also some not so good news. Anybody who is new to iOS programming, you see a lot of rookie mistakes. And for me, this was actually particularly painful because it really hadn't been that long since I myself had dealt with a lot of these issues. And so it really hurt to have a few of them come back to haunt me. And the three biggest problems that we ran into was that there were a ton of lines of code that quote unquote worked, but were still a giant mess. There were a lot of methods that got obscenely long, and then MVC didn't exactly stand for Model View Controller. So when I say that there was code that worked but didn't exactly do what we needed to, this is from the original version of Hum that I got from Aaron in October of 2013. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of code like this. Aaron had a really difficult time wrapping his head around storyboards, and at that time, he decided that the better way to do it is just to do it in code. So he was writing hard-coded frames, and he was using lovely hard-coded strings in a lot of places. And when I first saw this, I really wanted to scream. Nothing was using AutoLayout, and everything was just like this, and there were many, many, many lines of it. Here's the thing, it worked. We were in a single-width world at the time. We were not in this place where we were supporting rotation. We were not in a place where we were supporting the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. This worked for a really long time. And so code like this actually wound up living until we had to rip out a bunch of stuff and use AutoLayout in order to support rotation and the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. We were incurring technical debt, to be sure, but we had a product that was shipping and, more importantly, working for our users. It didn't matter that this code didn't look completely awesome. This is also something of a little bit more of a designer-specific problem. Designers want things to be in super specific places. And AutoLayout, for everybody who loves to complain about it, really, really hard to grok until you really have to. And so that's something where you're able to put that off as long as you possibly can. There were a couple other things when it came to working code that had very little to do with design. This is the view did load method that I got from Aaron when we were first starting. I bumped this down to 2-point font to get this, and I still couldn't fit it all on one screen. Looking at the actual code, this started on line 42 of the file, and it went to line 498. And it absolutely worked to load up the view. It made it really hard to hunt down crashes or figure out any particular code where it was that I might need to adjust. And so one of the very first things that I did was I broke this into a bunch of methods and said, okay, here's where we're setting up this thing, here's where we're setting up this thing, here's where we're setting up this thing. And it made it easier to keep relatively the same code, but have a way better idea of where everything was. So as I was refactoring it, I was able to figure out what pieces I needed to work with. Then there's not quite the MVC I had been taught. So developers know MVC is Model View Controller. For most beginning iOS developers, including Aaron, MVC actually means Massive View Controller. this is the line count on a version of our library view controller, which is the table view with all the stuff in it. I start to get a little twitchy when VC's line count gets over about 700 or 800 lines. So this gives me hives. But the thing is, it works. And I said this was a version of our app. It's actually the 1.5.1 version of our app, which is live in the store. I'm in the middle of a giant rewrite on this, which has trimmed it by more than 500 lines, but rewriting it wasn't actually necessary until we decided to switch to UI Search Controller as we're dropping support for iOS 7. I let that massive view controller go as Aaron built it because it worked. It allowed our users to do what they needed to do, and it allowed Aaron to keep updating stuff easily. He knew where everything was. And it's something that I have to keep really, really conscious of as I'm doing this refactoring, is like, as I'm doing this, am I making it clear how I'm breaking this into component parts? And so having those very long things can actually be helpful. There have been a couple of really great articles about elegant code versus code that gets the job done recently. Jared Sinclair had a really great one called Judicious Use of Shitty Code. Some of the worst code I've ever written has been in my most successful projects. And Brent Simmons had a great series where he talked about how not to crash. He talked about the mindset in his last one. If in the end code looks easy, unimpressive, as if a middle school kid could have written it, then good. Code is ultimately about simplicity, and what Aaron finds simple is significantly more explicit and often more repetitive than what I find simple. But it's something that I can work with to find something that works for both of us. And in the meantime, it's getting the job done. So we're actually going to take a closer look at something that we've open sourced, and we're going to talk about how we got it to a place where we wanted it to be from both a design and a code standpoint. So first, Aaron's going to talk about the design.
So we had that slider. I showed you that. In Hum, you can set the mood of a song, and technically this is just represented by a value between 0 and 100, right?
Yep.
And so most sliders that you see in iOS, they show that value, and so you don't need ticks or anything like that. But it didn't really make a lot of sense to surface like, this song's 100 happy. It makes no sense. So we needed a way to show some context only when you needed it. So when you tap on this and start the drag, you then see some ticks that allow you to say, oh, you're about halfway. Right now we're showing 9, but we eventually componentized it out so that you could do any arbitrary number, so long as it's odd.
Yeah, that is currently an open issue on the
So if anyone wants to submit a pull request. But I guess the point of my whole interaction with developers is, what if I had delivered that? Like, that could have been, and that often is, the final delivery for some people throwing it over the fence. And so much of the character of this control comes from those in-betweens, how they show up, how they disappear, when they disappear, how quickly, that kind of thing. So I delivered it with working code, and Ellen's going to speak to that. We cannot air quote hard enough during this.
So when I got this code from Aaron, this time I was actually able to get this on a single slide, so clearly he was improving. Here, he's actually overriding one of the touch tracking methods in UI Slider that facilitates popping up the ticks which are associated with the various positions in the slider. If I go in a little closer, I can sort of show you what's happening here. He's checking what segment he's in, and then he is updating the frame of the tick for that segment accordingly. So if it's lower than the segment, then he pops it down, and then if it's higher than the segment, then he pops it up. If it is the segment, then he pops it up. And it's something where this worked. This absolutely worked. But again, this was the length of the thing, and I was like, man, that seems like a lot, and even this seems like kind of a lot. So how can I work with this to make it a little bit easier and more flexible? So I said, okay, great, this is much better. Pop tick if needed from touch. Done. Okay, that's kind of cheating. So I'm going to show you that I use the code that I used to collapse all of this into a single method that worked for any arbitrary number of ticks. So in this case, we're figuring out where the thumb is, and I'm making sure that I can figure out how to get the actual bounds of where things are. and then I say, okay, where is the middle of the slider? And then basically I'm saying animate the tick if needed at a given index for a given touch. And basically what that does is it runs a lot of that same code where Aaron is looking and he's seeing, okay, what am I doing here? And it actually calls only a single UI view animation block, but it calls it with a tick from an array of ticks rather than saying, okay, I want to use a specific hard-coded tick and use a specific frame and do this for every single thing. It also is checking to make sure things are where they need to be before it does that. And so it's something where being able to see Aaron's intentions, being able to see the way that he wanted things to appear, the way that he wanted all of the ticks to pop in not just at the same time. One of the things that you can see if we go back to this guy, is you can see that those ticks, when they come in and they go out, they're actually kind of jumping up a little bit and then jumping out based on where the thumb is. And it's something where, for me, as a developer, I can't see that necessarily. I don't see that until I slow that way down. But because Aaron had been working to build this in code, I was able to see that right away. I was able to see, okay, this is the intention that he has. And I was able to take this gigantic pile of code and refactor it into a way that made more sense without breaking the crap out of the animation itself. And that's something where having that ability to understand the intention is really, really, really important. So since Aaron works for GitHub, I'm going to let him give our official open source address.
You can stay there.
All right.
GitHub.com. Just hum slider.
Yeah, so that is available. Yay. It's available open source. You can customize pretty much anything about that. It's pretty awesome. We're really proud of it. We're accepting pull requests if anybody wants it. It's MIT licensed, so go crazy if you're interested in working with it. And it is something where, as a developer, I don't think I possibly could have thought of that tick thing as a way to give context that doesn't really exist for sliders in general. But because I'm working with a designer who can build that stuff, it's been really, really amazing. So we're going to wrap this up with some tips for working with designers who develop. And I'll start this off. And I want to talk about, from the developer perspective, what can you do to help? First thing, talk about how conceptually to break things up into smaller pieces. Because whether it's breaking something that's a giant 450-line view-to-load method into smaller pieces, or breaking views into their component parts, you have to take some time to get the concepts down with the person you're working with so that you continue to have that same language, you continue to have that same understanding so that when the person you're working with wants to make updates, they know where to go. Second tip is really, really iOS specific. Build some AutoLayout helper methods which really clearly say what they're doing. We have a bunch of extensions on, categories on NS layout constraint, and there are things like constraints pinning view to super view in all directions, constraints pinning bottom of view 1 to top of view 2, constraint with equal attribute between view 1 and view 2. And by being that incredibly explicit and not expecting your designer to go through and be like, okay, wait, so I want to pin NS layout attribute top, NS layout attribute bottom, and then do that and this and fuck it, I don't want to deal with this. It not only helps your designer by not making them have to deal with auto layout, but it also helps them be much more explicit about what it is they're trying to do. If there's not an auto layout method helper that does that, then you can actually help them continue to be more explicit about what they want to do by building them a method that helps them do that. And it makes things much, much easier on the designer rather than having to work in a trial and failure basis to have these things. Also, please, for the love of God, start with auto layout. Please don't hard code things. The biggest thing is having empathy and patience. This is always really, really important when you're working with anybody who's learning to develop, but it's particularly important to keep in mind with designers who have taken the initiative to learn how to code. Keep in mind the designer who learns to develop is trying to make your life easier. even if they don't necessarily always succeed. Put yourself back in the noob's shoes. Remember how hard it was to learn how to develop for iOS, how long it took you to stop shoving all of your code into a single view controller, how to break code into reusable components, and not go completely crazy and have 700 different files for a thing with one view controller. You're going to need to answer questions too. There are going to be questions that you might feel are really obvious. And they're obvious to you because you've been doing this for a while. You know where to look for problems. You actually know where Apple buries their bodies. And you might have a good idea of where many C-influenced languages also bury their bodies. Be ready to draw a map. Be ready to help. Be ready to take questions with empathy and patience, and you will be able to help your designer who's coding learn how to be a better coder so that you are able to focus, again, on the pieces of it that are really, really hard and still have a really beautiful app. So Aaron is now going to talk about what designers who develop need to know.
So in my defense on the ticks, I know that I'm being super verbose. I get it. I could have thrown that all into a loop. I get it. But I wanted to be absolutely maddeningly obvious. So I really took the don't be clever advice to heart because instead of writing an email describing something or even prototyping something, because again, developers don't necessarily have your eye. And if you're just showing them a QuickTime movie of what you want this component to look like, that's not really describing it as best as even shitty code can do. So Ellen noticed those tiny little moments that she maybe otherwise wouldn't have because I was very unclever and very obvious. And then you can leave copious to-dos and fix-me's, and you can file a GitHub issue. You can do all kinds of things to say, hey, I know this is shit, but this is what I want it to look like. Let's move on from here and let's iterate. And then as a designer, just you can expect certain regressions after a refactor. Sometimes the better loop doesn't necessarily result in the exact same thing that you wanted, and so you sometimes have to compare. And one thing that I ended up doing with Ellen is I would just take screen caps and I'd slow them way down. I'd pop them into Photoshop, like actual videos, and then I would just highlight certain sections of the video when it was wrong, and just put a big red outline on it. Say, right here, that little jitter that you can't see at full speed, it's like a paper cut to me. I can feel it. So this is where but that's that's only after I am unable to fix it myself via a pull request or what have you, or committing directly to master like a boss. And so Jared summed it up so well when we were writing this presentation. He also wrote this, and it was perfect. I hate reading off of slides, but if your goal is to build a successful business, then stop trying to impress your heroes. Learn as you go. Be messy. Don't use new technologies. Don't use new languages for their own sake. Don't waste time trying to think of the most elegant way to break an egg. Just smash it on the counter and leave a fix-me. And move on. The only question that matters is this app fun, or are people getting what they paid for? Is it solving a real issue? That Jared Sinclair is a smart fella. And that's Hum. We're on Twitter. We're everywhere. We got shirts. And we do have some time for questions if you have any. I'd understand if you don't, but that's it.
Any questions? Yeah.
How long did it take you to learn? Like, you really started making?
Well, if you're not counting all the false starts, probably about 2 months to actually get something worth hacking on, something worth checking into to get. But man, I had so many false starts just through my agency days of wanting to tweak something for a developer, where it's just like, what is this? How is this? this verbose, even to, I'm used to color is this hex value, and then you've got UI color, and what the fuck is UI color to a CSS writer? And so, yeah, it was probably about 2 months of actual hard work.
What did you find, like, what were some of the tools or, did you use video tutorials or references that really helped you during that 2-month period to capture? What did you use to learn the language?
Some of the tools I used to learn the language were honestly just open sourced things. There were a lot of tutorials that were just outdated and wrong, which was super frustrating. Honestly, it was mostly Stack Overflow. So you Google something. A lot of the learning curve was to just figure out how to Google this, because I don't know what a list. Well, it's easy to find out right away that the list view is called the table view, right? But when you don't have that glossary, it's super hard to Google. But, and I didn't really have any mentors to ask. I hadn't met Ellen yet, so, you don't want to, I didn't have anybody to IM. But it was mostly finding sample code that worked. Having a look at Cocoa controls was one of the earlier things before CocoaPods and all of that, where I would see that people are clearly able to customize this stuff, and then I could go into the Git repo and figure out how they're doing this, if I could get the project to build, but, and this was around iOS 7 days when that was the switch, and so I understood things from an aesthetic level, and then from a technical level, things changed a lot, and then there was a whole period of the NDA where people knew, but they just weren't sharing it. And so, boy, it was tough. It was really tough. And that's part of the reason why I didn't go into a ton of resources for that, because there really aren't. There's this guy, Meng2, that has Xcode for designers. There was kind of a collective awakening, I think, around iOS 8 of designers were finally realizing, oh, we can do this. And so there are some people starting to demystify it now. But I used the Big Nerd Ranch, Aaron Hillgrass, I think is his name. I used that for some fundamentals. I had done a bunch of PHP and command line Java. I built a hell of a calculator on the command line at one point. So I did have those fundamentals, but slow going.
Yeah. What's interesting about hearing Aaron describe that is a lot of that is actually relatively similar to how I learned how to do iOS code. I learned the very basics of how to code through a class at UCLA Extension. It was like, here's what a for loop is. Here's how an if-else statement works. But when it came to working on learning how to code stuff, I went through a lot of tutorials, but a lot of it came down to figuring out how to ask the internet the right question to get back the answer that you need. It's really, really, really difficult to be able to do that just right off the bat, and I think it's a skill that I don't think a lot of people necessarily recognize as a skill, but it's incredibly helpful because you look at how huge iOS is and just how many things there are to remember on a regular basis. The human brain does not have that kind of capacity to remember all of that all of the time. You have to be able to know where to look for stuff. And that's something where it's interesting to me here that Aaron and I both went through relatively similar things, even though we're coming from completely different places.
I have great designers and coders on my team.
Sure.
And I want to, basically the line, between the demarc line today is still in Illustrator.
Yeah.
Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
Slicing. And I want to move that into the code or into Xcode. And I just want to figure out where the line, to draw the line today. And my thought is, storyboard plus a little code. So where would you, if you're at a high level, what would you say, what does that look like if they have access to both? But what I want to get rid of is the redundancy of creating a lot of assets.
Yeah.
And then having a coder to recreate that in the storyboard.
I think the real gateway drug is the prototyping apps that exist. Framer. God, there was one that came.
Who's the best in terms of prototyping?
Framer is pretty interesting because it forces the designer to express their ideas in code. It's in CoffeeScript, which is pretty basic JavaScript. But if they're learning that one step further to go to Swift or Objective-C is not that big of a deal. And they're describing things with math. And you can, as a developer, you can take some of that code and understand what the designer's intent was if they're not in storyboards or Xcode right away. I think apps like that are a really good gateway drug for that. For some reason, we didn't speak too much about it, but storyboards just didn't do it for me. They just didn't. They just didn't go far enough. I would design what I wanted, and then I would get stuck way sooner than just describing a box and then manipulating said box.
So you did load, was that all physical UI elements in code being created?
Almost all of it, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something where it was interesting because I in the great debate between writing all of your UI in code and using storyboards, I actually fall very firmly on the side of storyboards. This is the only app I've ever worked on where everything has been in code. And it's been interesting to sort of see the other side of that. But for me, it's definitely been something where I can see where there are ways to be considerably more explicit about stuff when you're writing it in code than there are when you're using a storyboard. You're also a lot less likely to have Apple make some kind of change to Xcode that suddenly breaks the crap out of everything you've been trying to do. It's definitely something where you're still going to run into API changes, but yeah, you do get some flexibility by writing stuff in code that you don't necessarily get with storyboards. But again, it's not going to work for everyone. And I think one of the things that's changed since you started using storyboards, the biggest one is IB designables. So you can actually have
everything I did was a blank box. So like, why would I? This is useless.
Yeah.
But it's gotten better, obviously.
Yeah, I used IB designables pretty extensively in one of the most recent projects I did for work, and I was able to get a UI that looked roughly like what it was going to look like on the phone. It wasn't the same kind of thing that you ran into on older versions of Xcode, where it would be like, okay, here's everything in blue buttons, and eventually this is all going to be the right color. Like, these are the actual colors, these are the actual fonts, and everything is actually looking the way that it's supposed to. So you do get that visual feedback a lot more easily. And I know at work, shorting the loop between design and development is always one of the hardest things to do. And I think one thing that I'm a huge advocate of is style guides, because it allows you to make some more reusable components in a way that make it easier for designers to communicate intent and developers to be able to build that to that intent. So I can talk about that for a really long time if you like, but I'll stop for other questions. Anybody else? All right, hey, thank you very much, guys.